Bad Brad Berkwitt Show is all about moving humanity forward and fighting for democracy. And remember, folks, every act of kindness is a little love we leave behind. Hey, folks, the man with the pinky ring and the New York thing. Forget about it. Bad Brad Berkwitt. And welcome to the Bad Brad Berkwitt Show on the Ringside Report web TV channel. Forget about it. Hey folks, this is Bad Brad Berkwitt, the host of the Bad Brad Berkwitt Show on the Ringside Report web TV channel. And I want to talk to you about sponsorship. If you're interested in being a sponsor on the Bad Brad Berkwitt Show that features network guests and entertainers and people from all walks of life in business and other areas, reach out to me at ringsidereport2014@gmail.com. Again, that's ringsidereport2014@gmail.com. I'm finally in a position that I'm ready to take on sponsors. So, hey, reach out to me and let's get you on board. I want to talk to you about my book, Boxing Interviews of a Lifetime. If you watch my show, The Bad Brad Berkwitt Show, you know that I love doing 360 conversations with all types of people. Well, I made my bones in boxing over a quarter of a century ago, interviewing world champion boxers, people in the sport, and entertainers that love the sport of boxing, which led to my induction into the Florida Boxing Hall of Fame in June of 2021. And that's the ring that you see me wear all the time on my show. Well, if you like to pick up my book, Boxing Interviews of a Lifetime, go to authorhouse.com. Again, it's authorhouse.com. And if you would like to get it personally inscribed or inscribed for somebody that you're sending it to as a gift, you can reach out to me and we can arrange for something as well. My return guest today is my brother in humanity and fellow democracy fighter, retired prosecutor, host of the beloved Justice Matter podcast, MSNBC legal analyst, and last but truly not least, he's a veteran. So we share that too. He's a return guest. He's been on many times over the years, been on my Moving Humanity Forward panels, and he truly is, as I said, my brother in humanity. Please welcome back to my show, the one and only Justice Matters guy, Glenn Kirschner. All right, my brother, welcome back.
Good to be back.
Absolutely. I got some talking points. I want to jump right into them. And let's start out like this, Glenn. The status of Trump's federal prosecution in D.C. and what might Judge Sharkin's litigation of the presidential immunity issue look like?
Yeah, it's interesting because we've all been reading all of these filings, right? Jack Smith, in a 165-page brief just a couple of weeks ago, laid out the narrative, right? The story of Donald Trump's January 6 crimes. And, you know, there's some powerful stuff in there. We knew a lot of it. There's some stuff that's new. And now we're kind of waiting to see when the appendix, the evidence that supports that narrative in the filing, when that's going to drop. It could be any day now. Today is actually the deadline, but Trump's lawyers just filed something today trying to put a stop to it. But then the next question is, Brad, and I don't know that we've spent much time on this, what in the world does the litigation look like over whether Donald Trump should have presidential immunity for all of his crimes or not? That's an open question. So that can take basically one of two forms. One, Judge Chutkan now will have all of the pleadings from both sides, the prosecutors and Trump's defense lawyers, and she'll say, okay, I'm going to haul you all into court. We're going to spend a few days, and I'm going to let you make your best arguments about why each and every act and each and every crime should enjoy presidential immunity or should not enjoy presidential immunity go. And we're going to have days and days of factual and legal arguments. That's one way the hearing could look. But the other way, and frankly, the one that maybe I'm pulling for, I certainly would have liked to have seen it happen before the election, but it won't, is turning this thing into a mini trial and saying, you know what, Special Counsel Jack Smith, I appreciate you filed a pleading telling me everything Donald Trump did, which you got from all of the witnesses, the dozens and dozens of Republican witnesses that you put in the grand jury who testified about Donald Trump's crimes. But I can't take anybody's word for what's on the paper. And Donald Trump is disputing that he did all of these things that all of those Republican witnesses, like Mike Pence, told the grand jury he did. Now we got to have a mini trial. So call your first witness. And then we will have literally a mini trial of Donald Trump's crimes. And Jack Smith's prosecutors will do direct examination. Donald Trump's lawyers will do cross-examination. Then the prosecutors get a brief redirect examination. And we're going to see the trial. We won't see it with our own eyes because, right, God forbid, we should have cameras in the federal courtroom and actually, come into the modern era. That drives me nuts. But we will see firsthand reporting of it in real time. And that will be incredibly eye-opening. I wish, Brad, that had all happened before the election, because I think the American people deserve to know exactly what this presidential candidate did to steal the election the last time. Instead, we remain largely in the dark, which is no way to run a country or an election.
You're preaching to the choir. Couldn't agree more, Glenn. The implications of Senator Whitehouse's report about the Trump White House killing the investigation into Kavanaugh.
Yeah, this really bothers me to my core. So we all know that during the confirmation hearings for Brett Kavanaugh, all these allegations of sexual misconduct came to light, and we heard a little bit from Dr. Christine Blasey Ford. And the FBI was doing the background investigation on Kavanaugh and his suitability or unsuitability to be a Supreme Court justice. And they did something that was not only unusual, I think it may have been unprecedented. They put out a solicitation to the general public for citizen tips of any Brett Kavanaugh misconduct, any information, right? Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. When law enforcement agencies put out a call for citizen tips, the citizens who put themselves out there and provide what might be some really explosive information about potential misconduct by a Supreme Court justice nominee, they put themselves on the line, and they have every reason to expect that those tips will be followed up on and professionally investigated, but they weren't. Instead, those 4,500 tips were packaged up by the FBI and delivered right into the hands of the mob boss himself, the guy who had every incentive to bury that derogatory information about the person that Donald Trump wanted to make sure he got on the Supreme Court so he could go about revoking women's constitutional privacy rights to make their own reproductive health decisions. And you give it right to the guy who has every incentive to misuse those tips. And Brad, not only did he bury those tips, and we now know, courtesy of Senator Whitehouse's dogged determination and investigation, we know that the White House told the FBI, you may not investigate this information after you solicited it from the public. That is a gross abuse of not only the White House, but I think of the FBI's responsibility to do the right thing with these tips once they came into the FBI's possession. Now, I love the FBI. I worked with them for decades. I hold them in high regard. But here's the thing. They will defend themselves by saying, well, wait a minute. This was a background investigation, not a criminal investigation. And under our rules and procedures, when we are asked by an agency to do a background investigation, we don't investigate criminally. We just take the information and we provide it to the agency who requested the investigation. To which I would respond, that's great that might be your rules and procedures ordinarily, but you all need to build some exceptions into those rules and procedures if you get information that shows that a guy like Brett Kavanaugh may have committed disqualifying misconduct, if not crimes. So you can't always hide behind norms and traditions, rules and procedures, though I'm a big believer in rules and procedures. You know, right. Director Comey departed from rules and procedures and helped tank Hillary Clinton's candidacy. So, but here's the other thing, Brad. Think about what Donald Trump, once he has these 4,500 bits of dirt on Kavanaugh, you think he might use them as leverage and hold them over Kavanaugh's head?
100%.
100%.
Yes.
100%. So this whole thing stinks to high heaven. But you know what? We're moving into the light. We really are. Because provided people get out in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal on November 5 or hopefully earlier, and maybe we can touch on why it's so important to vote early. It's a public safety concern at this point. Then we're going to have a prosecutor in the Oval Office, and she will understand need to address these gross abuses and the ruling class criminals, including up on the Supreme Court. She will understand the need to take these battles head on, win, lose, or draw, because thus far, neither Congress nor the executive branch, the Department of Justice, has taken this battle head on, but we have to do it.
No, I got a couple things I want to go over, but no, I want you to address that. We don't have to touch on it at the end. Let's touch on it right now about the safety of voting. Go ahead.
So here's the thing. First of all, people are already coming out in record numbers in Georgia and elsewhere, and I love it. My wife and I, we voted weeks ago as soon as early voting. Yep, as soon as early voting opened here in Virginia. Here's the thing. Donald Trump keeps telling his people, go be a poll watcher. Go be a poll watcher. You know what that means. Go intimidate folk who might be voting for Harris Walls. We're not stupid. We know what you mean when you send these missives to your boots. So if you vote early, then you're going to be at a far reduced chance of running into Donald Trump's dirty poll watchers than you will if you go on November 5th. Now, listen, I'm not trying to discourage or scare people into not going on November 5th, if that's the day you vote. Vote early and do away with that unnecessary risk that Donald Trump is trying to put in place to stop you from casting your vote.
Okay. I want to touch on the last talking point, a couple things. When the FBI did that, was Ray the one that was in charge of the FBI? It wasn't Comey, right?
It was Ray.
It was Ray. Okay. And also, I know these were allegations, and when I bring it up, you'll remember it, but I don't know if anything was ever done with it. Whatever happened to, what's going to call him Spuds? What's his name? Kavanaugh. When they talked about his financial issues that he had that all of a sudden were all gone, paid off or whatever. Yeah. He had a lot of debt.
He had a lot of debt. And based on the best reporting I've been able to review, and I can't swear I reviewed it all, I'm not satisfied that was nefarious. I don't know, because I don't think there's been a full-blown investigation into it. But I remember reading some reporting way back in the day about some family members rallying and helping him pay down some of that debt. And I hate to put this out because I can't even remember the source, but I remember at the time, these were legitimate news accounts that seemed to cut against, somebody swooping in and just giving him a bunch of money that he wasn't reporting. But to be honest, I'd have to go back a couple of years and refresh myself. Fine. But that's not an issue I'm willing to harp on, because I think there are bigger sort of misconduct fish to fry.
Okay. Let me ask you, does the Supreme Court, do they have to fill out an SF-86? Do they do or no?
They have the same. I can't say that they're the same, but the financial disclosure reports that you and I filed them for 30 years.
Every time I did SF-86, I had to fill out that stuff.
Once a year. They were annual reports. And let me tell you, I would sit there in my office at the Department of Justice, specifically the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Columbia, and they were the bane of my existence because I was scared to death. I'm going to put one decimal in the wrong place somewhere, and I'm going to report something as $10 instead of $100, and somebody's going to say I did something wrong. That stuff scared the what out of me, because I didn't want to even unintentionally mislead anybody about my financial disclosures. And the fact that dudes like Clarence Thomas don't even report $250,000 mobile homes and his mom's mortgage being paid off and his de facto son, somebody he claims he raised as a son, his tuition being paid by Republican billion. This is insanity, insanity. And so it led people like Senator Whitehouse and Senator Wyden to ask the Department of Justice, open a dang criminal probe on Clarence Thomas and Alito for seemingly violating our financial disclosure laws. And I think they asked that a special counsel be appointed for that purpose. And we got crickets from the Department of Justice. Congress, let's not let Congress off the hook. Brad, when Congress becomes aware of these gross abuses in the federal judiciary by Supreme Court justices, you open impeachment inquiries and investigations. That's what you do. And what have we gotten from Congress? Crickets. And each time we fail to take the ruling class criminals on for their apparent abuses and potential crimes, we're encouraging more of the same, and we're encouraging others to engage in those kind of crimes and abuses. You know, you can draw a straight line from Richard Nixon's pardon to Donald Trump trying to destroy our democracy. Why? Because we're not holding ruling class criminals like presidents and Supreme Court justices and senators and members of Congress accountable for their crimes. When in the hell are we going to learn our lesson? When is that going to change?
Okay. Will Trump be sentenced on November 26th in his New York case? And if so, what is the likelihood of a prison term? That's a question everybody is asking.
So the likelihood of a prison term is high, and I'll talk about why that is. But now let me turn to the other side of the coin, which is far less optimistic news. He will not be sentenced on November 26th. Here's why. And this is why I was never upset that Judge Merchan kicked the sentencing down the road until after the election, because it was going to be continued one way or another. Because Judge Merchan right now has to decide whether this asinine presidential immunity Supreme Court ruling impacts Donald Trump's 34 felony convictions. It doesn't, because he committed the lion's share of his criminal conduct before he was ever president. You don't get presidential immunity for something you do as a candidate. And yes, he wrote some reimbursement checks to Michael Cohen. Michael actually paid the money out of his own pocket at the direction of and for the benefit of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was cutting him reimbursement checks from the Oval Office, from his Donald Trump's own account. That ain't presidential conduct anyway you cut it. So that ain't going to get immunity. But here's the thing. Judge Merchan has to make this ruling. It's still an open question. He has to apply the new Supreme Court precedent on presidential immunity. And the minute he rules, and he will, I believe, that Donald Trump's 34 felony convictions stand. They are unaffected by the Supreme Court ruling, because none of what he did in that case conjures up presidential immunity. The minute he hands down that ruling, it is instantly appealable, because any issue of immunity is instantly appealable, unlike 99% of the rulings that judges hand down in cases every day that are not appealable until after trial, conviction, and sentencing. That's when the case is over. That's when you file your appeal on all of these issues, except immunity, because immunity says, listen, if you shouldn't be prosecuted, you shouldn't be prosecuted. So if an immunity ruling is handed down, you get to appeal it right away, just to make sure it's right. So he wasn't going to be sentenced anyway. So it kind of doesn't matter, because once that case gets appealed, it's going to be off in the appellate ether for goodness knows how long. With that said, Glenn, of course he's going to appeal it. But if it's prison, if he says you go into prison for 6 years and he automatically appeals it, does Merchan have the power to say you can, obviously he can appeal it, we know that, but can he put him in prison and he can appeal it from prison? So here's the way it plays out. The sequence of Judge Merchan's rulings will be: one, I'm denying your presidential immunity motion. Now let's proceed to sentencing, but you can't proceed to sentencing. Why? because the immunity ruling is immediately appealable, so the sentencing gets pushed off. Right.
Okay.
But the minute he gets to sentencing, whether sooner or later, and he imposes prison, and I believe he will, and I can tell you why I believe that, then what Donald Trump is going to do is run to the appeals court and try to get a stay on his prison sentence pending appeal. I don't know whether that will be successful or not. Here's why I say Judge Merchan will put him in prison, or at least sentence him to prison. Donald Trump committed 34 felony crimes to try to steal the 2016 presidential election. This is not a hush money case. It's an election interference case. He paid the hush money. He committed 34 felonies, falsifying business records to cover up the hush money payment, all to try to cheat in the 2016 presidential election. That's why I say this is an election interference case. He also committed 10 counts of of contempt of court by violating Judge Merchan's orders 10 times. And Judge Merchan convicted him on those 10 contempt of court crimes. Fined him.
Yeah.
There is no way, in my opinion, Judge Merchan can say, for all of this criminal conduct, including your refusal to abide by court rules and orders, I'm going to give you probation or I'm going to give you home detention at Mar-a-Lago. If you give Donald Trump home detention at Mar-a-Lago, that's sentencing him to binge watch Netflix and order DoorDash. That's a damn vacation for that you-know-what down in Mar-a-Lago. And what you do, if you sentence him to that kind of a vacation instead of a prison term, you are encouraging tomorrow's aspiring dictator to do it all over again and then some. And I think Judge Merchan understands that to his core. And that's why one of the reasons I believe he will sentence him to a prison term. Then getting him into prison is going to be up to the appellate courts.
Okay. The only remedy to the chronic law enforcement failures of our governmental institutions may be to get a prosecutor into the Oval Office. And I'll tell you what, I'm sure you watched the Bret Baier interview last night. He's a clown. And Lawrence O'Donnell roasted him like he does better than anybody else on TV and factual information about how he's part of the boys club. And she showed she was a prosecutor when he showed that clip out of context where he tried to say that he didn't say that because Trump said, I never stood the military. It's all lies. But off of that question, we get somebody like Vice President Harrison to the White House as a prosecutor, go from there.
Yeah, no, then I think we have some chance of, doing things that we have known for a very long time need to be done, like retooling our law enforcement priorities. If you're a poor kid and you snatch a purse or you sell a rock of crack cocaine, we're going to jump on you with both feet. We might even put you in pretrial detention pending trial. But if you're one of the ruling class criminals and you victimize large swaths of the American people, when you're Donald Trump lying about COVID and mocking it, calling it the Kung flu and blaming Asians, and what happens, a spike in violent crime against Asian Americans. You make up lies knowingly and intentionally. You lie about the Haitian population, whether Haitian Americans or immigrants or a mixture of both, stealing and eating pets. What happens? Donald Trump's base gets after these folks, bomb threats out the wazoo. You're endangering the lives of Haitians, Haitian Americans, and immigrants over and over again. Now, what do we have? You're lying about federal relief, hurricane relief efforts, and they're hunting FEMA.
Yes.
Government employees who are trying to bring much needed relief to hurricane victims. You do that, and we don't touch you. We don't hold you accountable. We don't do anything to protect the American people that you're victimizing. Brad, it's time to turn our law enforcement priorities not upside down, but right side up. I'm not suggesting that if somebody snatches a purse or sells a rock of crack cocaine, that we should turn a blind eye and not deal with it. But we know those are not the crimes that are destroying and victimizing large swaths of the American people. I wish I had an hour to talk about the way we need to reform the priorities of who we prosecute and how we prosecute them. Because you can deal with the low-level chronic offenders, the purse snatchers, the car boosters, the crack sellers. You can deal with them by addressing what is causing that chronic low-level crime, because we know what's causing it. You know what's causing it? Addiction, mental health problems, lack of education, lack of housing, lack of opportunity.
Yep.
That's what causes it. And yet we feel good about putting these folk in jail over and over again. Let me tell you, when you put somebody in jail over and over again without addressing the underlying problem, all you're doing is setting up tomorrow's crime and tomorrow's victims, because you're not addressing the problem that keeps bringing them back to the criminal justice system, right? So we need to do intake, the way we decide who we're going to prosecute and for what, in a completely different way. And I've done videos about that. But you need to hold accountable the ruling class criminals. That's big tech. That's big pharma. That's big oil. That's big Hollywood. That is the military industrial complex. Not that we don't need all of those services and goods, and we do. But when they commit crimes, we turn a blind eye. And you know what we do? We're like, well, just go ahead and pay a fine, pay some penalties, pay some back taxes, pay, and then y'all can keep doing what you're doing. So what they do is they work that into their operating budget.
Yep.
And they keep criming and abusing the American people. This is not rocket science. I'm a gutter kid from Jersey. I am not that bright, trust me. But this seems to be something that has needed to be fixed
common sense, but
forever.
It's common sense,
right?
What you're
forever,
saying.
And we haven't. But you know what? Maybe we get a prosecutor in the Oval Office who takes these reforms seriously. Boy, we can do a whole lot of good. And I think we're about to come into the sun, because I do believe it's going to be a lopsided election.
I
because
do too.
Throw the polls out. The polls don't mean anything.
I did a video yesterday. Those polls are BS. I'm tired of hearing about them polls. All right, I've got two more things. I want to read this and we'll talk about it on the other side. The first one, Debbie said, I got to talk to you about this, and I wrote something. I want to address it. But when we met and did our first show together a few years ago, you said on the record that Trump should be indicted for the COVID deaths he caused. That stuck with both Debbie and I, which we totally agree. With the news coming out of Bob Woodward's book, War, that this treasonous, evil bastard gave his handler or his owner, Putin, personal COVID tests, is there any chance he could be indicted finally for COVID deaths or get a pass because of the BS ruling of immunity from the corrupt Supreme Court?
There is always a chance that he's held accountable, and I'll do a quick 1 minute on why I believe I was a career prosecutor, but 22 of my 30 years, I was a homicide prosecutor and chief of homicide in Washington, D.C., responsible for overseeing all grand jury investigations and prosecutions in murder cases. So if I can bill myself as an expert on anything, it's the law of homicide. So yes, he could be held accountable. I also think the presidential immunity issue would loom large if we tried to indict him for the COVID deaths, because there's going to be a lot of wiggle room for him to say, hey, this is unprecedented, this pandemic. I was doing the best I could. Actually, he was doing the best he could to grift off it. But he was lying. I mean, Bob Woodward, when he reports that Donald Trump said, and he's got audio tapes to back it up, I'm lying to the American people. He didn't use the word lying. He's like, I'm downplaying it. I'm downplaying it now. I'm always going to downplay it. But you know what, Bob? It's so deadly. It's so easily transmitted, Bob. That's what he should have been telling the American people. Instead, you know what he did? He mocked reporters who took precautions to wear masks. He said to them, Brad, oh, you want to be politically correct. That's why you're wearing a mask. Do you know what many of Donald Trump's supporters took away from that? I am not going to wear a mask. I am not going to be worthy of being mocked by my president because I'm trying to take precautions from contracting a deadly, infectious disease. That's the signal he sent to the American people. He lied to them, and he sent the signal, do not take precautions or I will mock your ass. I mean, so here's the law that, in my opinion, gives rise to criminal responsibility for avoidable COVID deaths, not only by Donald Trump. I think you can throw Mike Pence as the head of the coronavirus task force and Jared Kushner into the mix. Remember, he said, it's killing more folk in the blue state than the red state. Let's just let it run rampant, right? It's good for us electorally. Really? Sport? Come on. So here's what the law says about involuntary manslaughter. You know, there are different levels of homicide. There's involuntary manslaughter. Some jurisdictions call it negligent homicide. Different jurisdictions call it different things. Involuntary manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, second-degree murder, first-degree murder, which is the big, granddaddy of them all with premeditation and deliberation and intentional killing. Let's go to the lowest level of homicide, involuntary manslaughter. Here's why Donald Trump's conduct satisfies the elements of that crime. Just 3 elements. You engaged in grossly negligent conduct and lying to the American people about the nature and transmissibility and deadliness of the coronavirus. When you lie to them and you tell them don't take precautions to protect yourself, that's grossly negligent conduct by an American president. So the first element is you engaged in some grossly negligent conduct, or for the sake of completeness, you had a duty to do something and you failed to do it, and your failure was a product of gross negligence. So the first element can be satisfied with either one of those 2 factual scenarios. Guess what? He satisfies both of them, gross conduct and a gross failure to protect the American people. Second element, your grossly negligent conduct or failure to act was reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury. When you're dealing with a deadly pandemic, you check that box in a minute. The third element is the place where some people think it's a sticking point, but I'm going to explain why it's not. Grossly negligent act, reasonably likely to result in death or serious bodily injury, and you thereby cause the death of another. That's where people will say, wait a minute. You can't say Donald Trump caused the death of another. He didn't shoot him. He didn't stab him. He didn't strangle him. He didn't bludgeon him. He didn't force COVID down their throats. Got you. He didn't cause the death of another. Well, hang on. What is the legal definition of causing the death of another? Causation is defined as your grossly negligent conduct being a substantial factor in bringing about the death of another, like lying to them and telling them they shouldn't protect themselves by wearing masks. That is a substantial factor in bringing about COVID deaths that were avoidable. There's a great news article from years ago of a daughter of somebody who owned a bar in New York, and her father died of COVID. And she said, my father used to say, Donald Trump says this is a fake. It's a hoax. I shouldn't wear a mask. I look stupid. And he contracted it and he died. Guess what? Donald Trump's conduct was a substantial factor in bringing about that death. Let me just do one quick hypothetical to put some meat on the bones of why this is a well-placed charge on Donald Trump. We had a case in D.C. This is not a hypothetical. It's actually an actual case where a would-be robber is chasing a victim down the street, going to rob him. The victim is running to get away from the robber. The victim darts out between 2 parked cars, gets hit by a car and killed. What was the cause of death? It was the car hitting and killing the victim, who was a substantial factor in bringing about the cause of death. The robber who was chasing him, that guy was convicted of second-degree murder, not just involuntary manslaughter. But that illustrates the point. Donald Trump ran us out into the oncoming pandemic. And that's why he is legally responsible for avoidable COVID deaths. I've been chewing on prosecutors. Anybody who will listen to me, I'm not a prosecutor anymore. I'm retired, saying, come on, guys, come on, gals, come on. And a lot of them behind the scenes are like, yeah, it's a good theory. It's a good theory. But nobody will do it because people don't want to take on the ruling class criminals. That's right. I'll tell you, I wish I could beat feet back in the government. Just, if I could have a say in influencing any of these charges that should be brought, or retooling our law enforcement and our prosecutive priorities. I'd love to do it. I'll tell you.
Okay. Last thing I want to ask you, it's actually an observation I have of you. Debbie watches you all the time. So she sends me clips. So she said, because you're everywhere. You're on TikTok now too. So I see a lot of your clips, and Debbie watches your shows all the time. I want to address this, and we'll talk actually on the end of it. You said from our first show as well that over the years you voted for both Democrats and Republicans.
Yep.
Would you ever think in your years on planet Earth that one party would be completely taken over by a racist, misogynistic pig, treasonous traitor, lying grifter, like Trump, which in my observation, you, Glenn, have probably become more political like me, because I was not political before Trump. I voted and all that, but I wasn't into all this stuff like we're doing now because of what I said about Trump than you have ever been in your entire adult life.
No, I've served in the federal government continuously under every president from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. And I, like you say, voted Republicans, Democrats, and independents. I always voted on the character of the candidate because, you could talk a good game as a candidate and everything you say could be completely in alignment with my political and ideological beliefs. But if I can't trust you to cast votes the way you say you're going to cast votes, well, then what good are you to me? So I was never a political guy. I was raised in a household where we didn't do politics. It was a conservative household, I would say, but my pop was a football coach and a wrestling coach and a boxer. So I did football, wrestling, and boxing. I didn't do politics. But, your question is a great one. I never in a million years thought that a whole political party would fall below this baseline of patriotism, this baseline of just a love of our democracy, what we have built here, this American experiment. But almost the whole Republican Party, with the exception of the Liz Cheneys and the Adam Kinzingers, have just fallen so far below that baseline of patriotism to follow their orange criminal deity. And it's beyond me how a whole political party could do that to the American people, could do that to their constituents. Now, I have a lot of hope that Cheney and Kinzinger become the face of the Republican Party once this Donald Trump Republican Party implodes, and it will. It will rise up from the ashes, and I hope it's the patriots, right? When Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger were like, my job is not as important as fighting to preserve our democracy. We can have our ideological disputes, but let's argue about them in the future once we have protected and preserved and now rebuilt American democracy. That's what we need. And then let's get back to arguing over policy and ideology. I actually think when you argue and you compromise, you probably get to the best result rather than just going into your separate corners and duking it out. But you can't negotiate with today's Republican Party because they're lawless. They're lawless, and they have no concern for the health and viability of American democracy. I never thought, my wife, Nilufar, who grew up in Iran and had to flee the revolution there because one day she's going to coeducational schools that look no different from the schools here in the U.S. And, going to school with boys. And then not that long after the revolution in 1979, some of those same boys are pointing automatic weapons at her head and her mom's head, saying, cover up your hair. She said, I've seen this movie before.
Yeah.
I've lived this movie before. I know what Donald Trump is trying to bring to America, and my family had to flee that. Are you kidding me? I mean, and she walks the walk too as an immigration lawyer. So we are in such a bad spot right now, but I think we're coming into the light. And I think as long as we get to the polls in numbers too big to rig and too real to steal, both on November 5 and importantly, even before November 5, I think we're going to be okay.
Okay. All right. We'll close out that note. Hey, as I always tell you, we appreciate what you do. It makes a difference. Your voice, I know you've seen the people say, hey, will you be the attorney general? I know what you told me privately and publicly, but, people are just saying it because you got balls and you care about the country, you care about law. And honestly, we didn't talk about Merrick Garland and the accusation in the book that President Biden said, he regretted that decision. But I hope, when she wins, that we get a really, really strong, as you said, being a prosecutor, someone in that Department of Justice that doesn't take no crap.
I sure hope so, because DOJ, my beloved former agency, has really fallen down on the job. I mean, the fact that we've got people in Congress, current members of Congress and former members of Congress, who knew they'd committed crimes on and around January 6th and asked for pardons from Donald Trump because they wanted to get away with those crimes. That's a confession of guilt, according to the Supreme Court. and the Department of Justice has done nothing. They continue to let those people try to kill democracy from inside, and it's inexplicable to me why it took the January 6th House Select Committee hearings exposing all of the crimes of Donald Trump and his co-conspirators to even get DOJ off the dime. I don't know, but we need a bulldog attorney general.
Before you go, I got to ask you off of what you just said, because you talked about it before on my show. I think you called it pocket pardons or something like that. Is it possible that some of these people like Gates or these other ones that asked for the pardons, that he may have given them, and when it comes time to nail them, they could say, hey, I got a pardon, and no one knew about it? Is that possible?
Always possible. I still can't believe Donald Trump didn't give himself a pardon. When was he ever one to forego a good grift, right? All he had to do is sign a pardon to himself, put it in his pocket, and then if he's ever convicted, he can pull it out and say, but I'm glad you took all the trouble to get me through a trial finally and convict me, but now here's my pardon, so bye-bye. I can't believe he hasn't given one, because it's important to remember that there's nothing in the law or the Constitution that says for a pardon to be legitimate and enforceable, it has to be made public, in some big signing ceremony. No, a president under the Constitution can give one quietly behind closed doors, and we wouldn't know about it unless and until the recipient tried to use it. So might some of those folks in Congress have one? Maybe, but if they did, I'd sure like to know about it. And then the question would be, should DOJ try to litigate a corruptly delivered pardon to make sure that we're not letting tomorrow's criminal president run roughshod over the American people? I mean, we got a lot of hills to climb on the presidential immunity front and others. But again, let's get a prosecutor in the Oval Office, and then we're all going to be able to take that uphill climb together.
Okay. Close out of that note. Thanks again for coming on, Glenn. And if I don't, I'll talk to you before, but if we get crazy around the election, what goes on, rest of your family during the holidays too.
Thanks, Brad. Good being with you.
All right. Take care.